Thank you all so much for joining the Public Interest Privacy Center today in partnership with the Data Support Integration Center. My name is Amelia Vance, and I am the president of Public Interest Privacy Center and chief counsel for AASA, the school superintendent's Student and Child Privacy Center. Joining me today is my colleague, Morgan Sexton, and also expert on all things AI, Brenda Leong, Luminos.Law. So, Brenda, do you want to take a minute and introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. After expert on all things AI, I'm not sure what I can say. I'm a partner at Luminos.Law, which is a law firm in the District of Columbia, founded between a partnership of lawyers and data scientists, specifically to deal with all things AI. And so we have a lot of experience with corporate clients incorporating AI systems, developing them, deploying them, operating them, user-facing, back-end, whatever, and doing both governance and frameworks for managing those systems, as well as doing audits and things of those systems. So sort of our whole focus is trying to help companies figure out what to do with AI as regulations and technologies tries to keep up, or regulations try to keep up with technology, and they're, doing things before there's clear guidance on how to do them.
Perfect. Thank you, Brenda. So, as Brenda somewhat referred to, part of the reason we're doing this webinar today is as I've talked to folks in the integrated data systems community, as I've really talked to everyone in the education community, there is a definite lack of what on earth should we be doing? How do we navigate this? What even is this? How do we incorporate it? How do we do things in an ethical and equitable way? What is the law here? And so this webinar is going to do a little bit of basic 101, a little bit of going in depth and pointing to some resources in particular areas that integrated data system stakeholders should keep an eye on, and then dive into a discussion with Brenda and I, and answering any audience questions we have. So with that, let's kick things off. So Brenda, do you want to talk to us about some high-level definitions here?
Sure. So obviously the biggest challenge in talking about AI is what the heck is AI? And it doesn't really have one single consensus definition. We're sort of narrowing in on that as more legislation develops. But basically, it's easiest to just think of it as something that traditionally would have required human intelligence to do. Like that's the sort of layman's understanding of it. And that means it's more than just machine learning. It's other kinds of advanced analytics. It's other kinds of sensing the environment, seeing, hearing. All the kinds of things that basically in the past you had to be a human to do, but now some machines can do. And then there are some developing more technical definitions as the OECD and the EU AI Act develop that they're putting in place. But that's the best way to think about it. And the sort of more programmy description of it is obviously it's a branch of computer science. And it is different from traditional programming in the sense that programs prior to machine learning would be written by the programmer with a specific set of steps that would be repeated the same way every time. And basically they were applied to data or problems or situations in order to get answers. The way machine learning works is you sort of put in the data and the answers, and the program figures out what the rules are, what the parameters are, and thus it makes it a predictive system that now you can put that same question back in again, and it can say, yes, it is a cat because I learned what cats were, and I know that that's a cat and not a dog or a canary. And so then you can put in, things like employee performance and get rankings, or you can put in financial data and get credit scores or credit recommendations for loan applications. So it's turning out predictions or scores of some kind. And this is what's basically called traditional or predictive machine learning, which is most of the machine learning we had up until recently when we were stunned with the introduction of generative AI into the world, but we'll talk about that separately in a minute.
Perfect. Thank you for that introduction, Brenda. Please feel free to put any questions you have into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen throughout the presentation. Want to make sure we're addressing your questions. So let's talk for a minute about the potential benefits and risks. Perhaps the easiest way to do this is taken from the White House's recent executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of AI. So, responsible AI has the potential to solve urgent challenges, but irresponsible use could exacerbate societal harms. So, passing this over to Brenda again, I love this slide of sort of common failure modes. Can you talk a bit about this?
Yeah, so obviously the big reason we talk about AI or computer systems or software in general is because it doesn't always work and things go wrong. So what does it look like when an AI system goes wrong? What is it that happened? And so there are a number of sites and organizations and places that track this information. And one that we're somewhat affiliated with and that we use very regularly is called the AI Incident Database. And this chart is a little bit old in the sense that it reflects data up from ending about a year ago. So there's probably a lot of things that we could add to it and it might shift the proportions a little. But basically over the last several years, up until maybe a year ago, the general categories of failure in the sense of what went wrong when an AI system had an incident of some kind fell into these different categories. So lack of transparency or accountability means not just that somebody thought, I don't really understand this, but that something happened, that somebody needed to appeal something or somebody was trying to apply the information out of a system and couldn't because they couldn't get enough support. So each of these has a lot of detail behind it, but discrimination, as you can see, unfairness, bias, we've all heard about bias of algorithms, bias of AI systems is the largest category. I think that's probably still true, even if we put in the new data. And then security breaches and things like that are smaller because that's something that already has a lot of sophisticated protections and developed controls. And there are new risks in AI systems, but largely they still continue to be networks and computer systems that we know how to do security for, to some degree at least. And then, privacy is obviously a problem in certain cases, and physical safety is something that we have to think about in AI that we don't always have to think about in every other kind of software system. So when something goes wrong in the physical world based on something that happened by AI, it creates an incident as well. And the reason that we, again, are worried about things going wrong with AI is because just like in the traditional world of privacy, we talk about harms. The lack of sufficient privacy is harms to people of some kind based on collection and use of their data. The lack of sufficient rigor or responsible control over AI means that there are harms to people. They don't get their credit application approved, or they get misdiagnosed because of the health data not being read correctly, or they get not selected for a job opportunity. And as with so many, unfortunately, systems and technologies that we've seen in the past, these harms are not distributed equally across all groups, but tend to occur in groups who tend to be already marginalized anyway. So it could be demographic categories, it could be economic categories, but they tend to have greater effect or occur more often. These harms occur more often or to a greater extent, where they can, probably least be mitigated easily by the individual. So that, of course, increases our concern as responsible users of AI to figure out how to predict where those harms might fall and then find ways systemically to either identify that or prevent that, or at least create channels to respond to that.
Absolutely. So, in addition to these ethical equity harms, there's also a number of legal implications here, especially for state and local agencies. So, obviously, you have the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, you have the Civil Rights Act, you have Title IX, Fair Housing Act. There was a great statement that was put out from the FTC, DOJ, CFPB, and EEOC, where they talked about claims of innovation must not be cover for law breaking. There's no AI exemption to the laws on the books. and in this case, the statement of FTC chair, the FTC and these other agencies will vigorously enforce the law to combat unfair or deceptive practices or unfair methods of competition. So we'll talk a little bit towards the tail end of the presentation about what it means to know. How do you even determine that there may be some bias or some issue that could violate one of these laws? Stay tuned. So I always love to talk about anytime we're talking about data sharing, data collection, what is the original goal? What do we want to do? What are we trying to enhance, particularly when it comes to data that is being shared with integrated data systems? It may not have been collected originally for the purpose that it's now being used for. You're trying to make evidence-based decisions, but maybe that data was originally collected for taxes, for providing social services, for education in general. And so thinking very carefully about not just combining all of the data and trying to figure out what you can do with it, but instead really zooming in on what is the goal? What is the question or the issue that our agency is trying to address, or that our state is trying to address, our region of states? Because the more that we can figure out what is that goal, the more we can figure out what are the pros and cons and what is the risk analysis we have to perform to decide whether applying AI in this particular situation makes sense. So I really love this report that's actually a few years old now from Upturn in the Omidyar Network, the public scrutiny of automated decisions. So they note that automated decisions aren't just sort of from the blue, as Brenda talked about. They are coming from what we feed into them in many ways. But you have a mix here of human judgment, conventional software, and statistical models. But the non-technical properties of these systems, for example, what the purpose is and constraining policies, are just as important and often more important than their technical particulars. So emphasizing that very strongly. Brenda, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, so I just want to point out, like you said, this is several years old, which, you know, in the world of AI can sometimes feel like maybe not relevant or maybe out of date or something. But I just want to point out that the NIST AI-RMF risk management framework that was published a year ago and is becoming, you know, sort of the de facto standard in the US for responsible AI governance takes exactly this approach and is very specifically says that AI operates in the real world and has to be considered as a socio-technical system, in the sense that it's not just math and programming that needs to be fixed or monitored. It needs to be looked in context of how it affects real people in real cases, whether it's health or finance or employment or whatever else, students and children especially. So, you know, this is very much the mindset that I think is developing as legislation and governance regulations start to be developed more specifically.
Absolutely. I also really like this comment from Virginia Eubanks, one of the scholars who started looking at integrated data systems and algorithms years and years ago, often critical, just as a flag. But she noted that sometimes government automated decision-making tools are created in a context where the assumption is that there's a shortage of resources. So sometimes it's about how do you triage the resources that we have instead of coming into developing a system with the more neutral objective of how do we get resources to the people who need them. So being aware and thinking about, as you look at what the goal is of sharing data, the goal of developing these systems, it's very important that we consider, you know, are we trying to triage limited resources, or are we trying to identify the best ways for government to serve people to reach a particular goal? So wanted to flag that as we go into a case study of a really nuanced and difficult program that has been around for a long time. So, Morgan, do you want to talk through our case study?
Yes. So one example of a tool that's been developed really thoughtfully with a specific goal to enhance child welfare call screening decisions is Allegheny County Family Screening Tool. So the Allegheny County Department of Human Services has been using this tool since August 2016, and it's rarely used on its own. There are people in the loop. It's used when a call comes in and or a referral, it's called. And when staff receive that, they also receive a predictive score based off of this tool. And they combine that with the information that they have and can come to a decision more efficiently with just better informed information. Before they implemented the tool, they had to do all of that manually, integrating the loads of data. And it meant that 27% of the highest risk cases were being screened out, so they weren't being investigated. And 48% of the lowest risk cases were being screened in, so they were being investigated and using agency resources on them. So even critics have said that this tool was developed through an intentional, considered, ethical process. This quote specifically is from algorithmic discrimination expert Virginia Eubanks in her book, Automated Inequality. And I really like that it points out just the thoughtfulness behind the design and implementation. And on the flip side, there's also criticisms specifically about how the tool may still perpetuate inequalities, in this case, poverty profiling, that there's still questions remain about variable weights, error rate, potential limitations on human discretion. But I think it's important to highlight well-intentioned design and implementation as we go forward with implementing AI technologies in IDS. And just to remember that question at a high level, like what is the purpose? What are you trying to achieve? And why are we integrating the AI?
Absolutely. Thank you, Morgan. So, moving on, as I said, we're going to go really fast to solutions and supports. I want to throw out there, instead of at the end of the presentation, in the middle, and we will distribute these slides to everyone and have them available online, a number of helpful resources. When I have asked people for resources, they have said, I have no idea, but what should we do? If you know of other resources that are useful here, please let us know. We'd love to highlight them. So these resources are a mix of general explanatory, how do you deal with this in different contexts, such as algorithmic bias in housing and lending, what is general best practice when you're dealing with AI? What are we even talking about when we say AI in a privacy context? A article that we had written for Data Integration Support Center focusing on implicit bias, but also some specific toolkits here. I think it's so important that we, and Brenda, you may disagree, I don't know, but that we not overcomplicate, that we look at some basic things and not feel overwhelmed by the technology itself. So let's see, I think I'm gonna try and share this particular screen that I have here, and we'll see if it's successful. So this is actually one of my favorite resources that I share with everyone. It is a whole 7 pages long. And I point people to the last 2 pages all the time because some of the big issues that we're looking at are accuracy and error, and how do you deal with that? And then how do you deal with injustice that may come up with the fact that when you're dealing with digital benefits, as mentioned, you're dealing with a system that really is focused on lower socioeconomic status individuals and the bias that already exists in that system. So this doesn't have to be overly complicated, and hopefully these tools can provide some supports to all of you in your work that you can share. And again, please, please do share with us any other resources or resources that you develop that we can share, because this is an area where people are clamoring for resources and it doesn't seem like there's too much. However, one place that we can look is federal agencies. So there's been a lot of action recently with the AI executive order, with other things. There's a lovely book, The Law of AI for Good by Orly Lobel, where she talks about some of the ways that automated tools are being used to make decisions. So Department of Veterans Affairs using AI in administering veteran benefits. Department of Ed's automated chatbot to help navigate student loan applications. Just a whole bunch of stuff. And part of this federal agency work on AI has included the creation of internal governance resources. There's nothing I love more than people being able to grab resources from other people and apply them to their own situations. So my favorite agency of the year is Health and Human Services, which has some amazing internal governance resources that they have begun to develop that are already online, available to anyone. So, for example, they have a discussion and a checklist of asking first and foremost if AI is the right approach for whatever the business problem is, for doing a cost benefit analysis, and considering potential risks. So considers things like, is it fair and impartial, transparent or explainable, responsible or accountable, safe and secure, privacy protective, robust and reliable. They include sample AI use cases. So very specifically, here are ways to talk about this. Brenda, do you have something to add here?
So relative to that point you were just making about, is AI the right approach? I think that really can't be emphasized enough. And two sides of that. One is it the right thing? And all the questions you just asked, but another is to make sure you compare it to, what are you doing now? What are your alternatives? How well do they work? In other words, sometimes we kind of tend to think about AI and think, oh, well, it's going to make errors. It's going to have these problems. And of course it will. But the question is, what are your reasonable, affordable, actionable alternatives? Because many times there aren't good alternatives that don't also demonstrate bias and make mistakes and have flawed outputs. And so we know many of our systems are, not great now. And so my video froze a little bit. Can you still hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So just to contextualize that question about, is AI the right answer? Is AI the right answer relative to your other possible answers? Because that's the realistic choice you're making. There is no perfect solution. Sorry, just want to throw that in there.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you for adding that. It's absolutely true. And one of the reasons I really like Orly Lobel's book on these issues is because she talks about, not emphasizing the perfect, but instead really looking at, what are you doing now? What are systems doing now? How are things being evaluated versus when you add AI, as opposed to thinking about AI versus a perfect, unbiased world. So some other resources from HHS, they have things like a research and design risk review checklist. So you can tell I am absolutely in love. They talk about how different principles should be applied. How do you actually apply them? Who are the stakeholders that maybe should be included as you deal with these issues? And then goes into deeper detail on things like, okay, when we're talking about what fair and impartial means, you can evaluate potential impact to protected and non-protected classes. And they talk through some things that you can go through and think about. I won't go into great detail here. Brenda's going to discuss a little bit of what can be done here, but just noting again that these are checklists that exist, that are publicly available, that can be adopted into existing data governance practices and applied to any algorithm or use of algorithms, AI, in your integrated data system. Same there, talking about privacy impact assessments, thinking about obtaining approval for use of sensitive data. What are the laws? And then also providing resources on how you actually apply these in developing, training, and deploying them. So again, being very practical about how you do this before you launch something, when you are launching something, when you're already implementing something, and then also how you can make sure that people understand why it matters, because you can have a great policy set up. This is again where I love HHS's materials, but they include these examples of inaction. Here's where people were harmed because some of these protections were not put in place. And that's incredibly important as well, because if it's just some abstract harm or no harm that people really understand, then they're not likely to go through checklists and spend the time that it takes to really think through these principles. So turning things back over to Brenda, specifically wanted to talk about fairness and discrimination testing. So getting a little more into the technical weeds, as I think most people would consider them. So go ahead, Brenda.
It is very meaty. So yeah, well, all these grandiose ideas of fairness and, by not having bias and things like that. What does that look like? How do we address that? First of all, there is no system that's not biased, that has zero bias. So if somebody tells you that they're removing bias or that they have an unbiased system, you should run because they either don't know what they're talking about or they're lying, one or the other. But we can measure for types of bias. Where is it showing up? What are the most prevalent kinds? How is it being demonstrated in the outputs of the system? And this is, math and statistical tests. We're looking at, sometimes it's about the data inputs. A lot of times it's about the data outputs, the machine learning predictions, those ranks and scores. We can look at the data that's being used, how it's being prioritized and weighted, and then what that generates as the outputs and sort of what the distribution of that is. So I'm sort of saying it in, general words as much as I can for hopefully easiest understanding. But there really is a lot of math and data science behind this in terms of what statistical testing is used. And these are established statistical tests like differential validity, adverse impact ratio, linear regression, and things like that, that existed before AI and are now being applied to the AI systems in use to try to understand the relationship of the variables within the system and the actual, again, impact of the different features and factors that are included and what weights they're given and so forth. So this is an area where there's a lot of things evolving, because what we really need is new statistical tests that are designed specifically for AI systems. But to design a reliable and useful statistical test that you're willing to, like literally go to court with is not a small thing and doesn't happen overnight. So those things are still evolving. And in the moment, we are approaching this from what are the tests that we have? What do they show? How much can we rely on them? How can we respond to whatever findings we have on what harms we think might be, in a particular system's application? And then how can the company do something about that or use that as a monitoring tool to make sure that it doesn't sort of get out of balance, so to speak, or doesn't start demonstrating, for example, disparate impact bias in some context. So using those known tests and those known legal standards that do exist, we can evaluate AI tools through that lens. And that's, as lawyers, that's what we're trying to do, is tell our clients, here's a reasonable approach given the tools and resources we have, we collectively, the community, the world of technology and AI have right now. But it is constantly changing. We've refined our process several times over the several years that we've been doing these kind of audits. There are, especially now since the executive order, a lot of energy and resources being put towards this in terms of how to do targeted testing that's particular to AI that might build on some of those known test processes and make them better for things that are on neural networks and all the uniqueness of AI. So it's developing all the time, but we can tell the specifics of how what fairness might mean and how we can measure it.
Just really quickly, Brenda, for everyone who heard, some of those words and went, oh my goodness, my brain is shutting down. And I never
Totally
thought
fair.
my career would involve computer science and math. Where can people look to learn about these things? I know you mentioned NIST earlier, but particularly when you're dealing with government agencies, or just someone who wants to learn about what this testing looks like to get a little more in the weeds. Where are some places to do that or things to learn about it? Because obviously,
I'll be honest, there's not a good central or a good one place to do that, because this is still very much evolving. And without trying to make it sound like, we're super amazing, we actually are one of the first firms to do this. We were founded to do this, and we've been doing it for 4 years, which in the world of AI is kind of a long time. So, we have written some papers on about auditing AI systems and put out some resources. That said, the couple places that I can think of in a legal sense, first of all, New York City put out a law last year, or it went into effect last year. It was actually passed a year and a half or so ago, about the use of automated decision-making, i.e. AI, in employment contexts. And it's called New York City Local Law 144. And it very specifically walks through the math, the testing, the scoring method. What are you looking at? What numbers are you trying to report? It looks at bias for race, gender, and also intersectionally across those two categories. And it gives you the scoring process, 2 different tests to do, an adverse impact ratio test and a scoring test. And it literally provides the entire guidance of how to do that. So there are some things to critique about that law, and there's some challenges, but it's a great example. Everyone, I think, involved has learned a lot from it, because it's the first one to really go down to that level of detail in a mandated format that says not just audit your system, but here's what that audit will look like. Here's what you measure. Here's how you report it. Here's who you report it to. Here's how you display it to the public or to the people at large. So that is, a really useful sample or example. I don't think it's the final word in audits, because like I said, we've learned a lot from it. And I think even New York City is already planning how to change some of the scope and definitions of that. And then there are other companies and consultancies out there doing this same kind of thing, who some have more public than others access to the tools and techniques they're using. And then NIST is developing, some of these kinds of standards, like what are you going to measure to, and how are you going to apply, and what legal standards are going to apply in different contexts. So it's a little bit scattered, but there is developing scholarship and best practices and academic inputs and things like that on this question for what does fairness really mean, and how does that, and we're going to see more of that coming soon, because the EU AI Act is calling for audits, which once it passes, the countries will need to determine what that means, what an audit is. And there are, many people writing papers and looking into the details of that. So kind of a moving target right now, but unfortunately not 1 or 2 pinpoint things to go look at in the short term, but there are resources out there.
Great. Thank you so much. I know that's a hard question, and something that's just incredibly difficult to do. And I would point out, Seattle and some other cities that have a long-standing sort of smart city guidance often includes some things about algorithms. Basically, there was a whole scope of scholarship put out around algorithms starting maybe 6-7 years ago, where there are a million examples and papers and a lot of stuff that's relevant today, particularly the ethical and policy questions. And so if you're not finding anything about AI and blank, whatever you're trying to do, housing, social services, whatever, looking up algorithms. And that word can be very, very helpful. So we mentioned that generative AI has its own very special potential risks and problems. So Brenda, can you talk a little bit about these?
Yeah, so the main thing is that generative AI is in fact a completely different kind, or not completely, but very significantly different kind of AI, different category, subcategory of AI. It's still a kind of machine learning. It's still a system that takes data and learns from that data. But instead of using that data to sort of develop its own rules for predictive outputs that will then give you like a binary yes, no, or a ranking or a score, what it's going to do is generate entirely new content, as I'm sure everybody really realizes, but I'm going to, walk through that anyway. So LLMs, large language models, are these systems that have taken in just tremendous, almost unfathomable, if I'm saying that word right, amounts of data, and then now can generate text, can generate images, can generate computer code. Those are the three main categories. Some video along with the images, and it's entirely new content usually. And the whole point is that it's not, it's not operating in the same way to create something targeted backwards towards what that data was, but something entirely new. So that's great. Sounds fun and exciting, and it can be, and it is, but the computer isn't actually, alive or learning in the way that a human brain does. And so it really doesn't always, comprehend anything really, but it doesn't really get the distinctions between fact and fiction, between, reliable sources and not reliable sources. And so it's just going to generate output that is literally designed to be what people like to hear. The way these systems were designed, if you think back to like predictive text, when even now, autocorrect that will try to correct your word for you. And sometimes it gets it right and sometimes it gets it wrong. And then from that predictive text to like finish your sentence for you. And then more predictive, where it would like try to give you several sentences in an email or something. And now, of course, we have the full scale thing. The way each of those stages was developed was the system was being trained on data and was generating these outputs, and they were sort of like upvoted and downvoted in the same way you fix your Spotify playlist by people, humans, sitting out there just reading the outputs, the prompt, and then the output, and they would vote up the output that they liked the best, that they thought answered the question best, sounded the best, flowed the, smoothest, or the picture that was the most understandable or emotionally impactful or whatever. So it was humans deciding which of the outputs were good or bad, better or worse. And then that information would be fed back in. And so the next time it generated that same kind of story or image, it would reflect those preferences. And so it would sort of slowly grow in those directions. So it literally has been trained to give us what we want to hear. This is not, even though some of them are now tied to search engines, this is not a search engine. It is not tied to prior outcomes, such as everybody who searched for, best show of 2023 got sent to the Tonys or something. It's just what people responded to best in this. And so it might pull from actual output, it might make up output, it might pull from fictional sources, and it will likely combine all of those, because the training data is gone. It's not sitting there in the program anymore. The program has been trained, and now it's going to keep regenerating things based on what it saw during training. So sometimes it might look very much like the training, sometimes it will not. Sorry, I went into more detail there than I think we probably intended, but that's the whole point of these systems, is if you think about them from where they came from and how they were developed, there was nothing in anything I said that had to do with truth, fact, logic, or credited sources, or tied to something that can be reproduced. So you can go into ChatGPT or any of the others. People tend to use that one as the example, but they're all similar. And say, give me, for example, I've gone in and said, give me some studies that show that essential oils are effective medical care. And that's a very controversial topic, not here to resolve that question, but I asked it for that to see what it would do. And it gave me several papers in sort of citation format. And I looked at them, and one of them was in fact a study that had seemed to find some correlation between using essential oils and improved health outputs. Okay, that was basically what I asked for. The next one was actually a study that very scientifically evaluated and proved just the opposite, reached very strong conclusions that essential oils had no correlation with improved health outputs. They were bad for you, but they also had no positive outcome. So that was the opposite of what I asked for, even though it was just listed as another, here's a source. And the third one wasn't a paper at all. There was no real paper. It was entirely just created. So it sort of knew that people are usually looking for a handful, 2, 3, 4 sources. And so it gave them to me exactly how they would look, with names and titles and dates and publication information and volume numbers and all of that, but really no direct correlation to what I had actually asked, at least past the first entry. And you probably all read in the news other examples of that. Lawyers submitting briefs with cases that didn't exist, and other kinds of things that were, and that's what's called hallucinations. Things that are just not true, not real, that it just made up to match what we think a citation would look like, and that's all it knows. It knows this is what you're expecting to see in a citation, and so it gives you that. The other
Really
list,
quickly,
right, go ahead.
Brenda, just because this is something that you told me as you were teaching me about AI and ways to talk about it, I want to mention this specific example where you had said you test AI by looking up a particular figure in the privacy community and seeing sort of how accurate that it actually is. And the fascinating thing for me was less like the fact that the AI sometimes hallucinated like a degree that didn't actually exist or the school, but it hallucinated birth dates. So stuff where there was a clear factual answer somewhere on the internet still made things up. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think people figure like when it comes to like basic facts like that, it is accurate.
Yeah, and that's where people get into the most trouble, because like I said, I asked for sources. I didn't say, are essential oils good for you? And it said yes or no. I said, give me studies that show X. And it gave me studies as a study should look that didn't actually show X. So this is another great example. This is something people can do on their own as well. If you are famous enough to have had any kind of presence on the internet, you've done some speaking, you have an online bio, whatever, you can put in yourself and say, write the biography for me, and just put in your full name, and it may be able to do that. Sometimes it will say, basically, I can't find that person, and don't feel bad. It says that about me sometimes as well. Depends on the day and the platform. And I speak online a lot. So theoretically, there's a lot of things they could find about me, but, for people that it does find, it will generate a biography, and it looks exactly like you would think an online biography would be. Several paragraphs: where you were born, where you grew up, where you went to school, what your specialty is, a couple places that you've worked, and maybe a couple of other facts, and something else at the end. And it reads very nicely and smoothly. Many of the most uncontroversial facts, like the date you were born, the place you were born, and where you got your undergraduate degree, are almost certain to be wrong in every single case. It just knows that you're supposed to have a birthday. Sometimes it tends to be within a couple years of your age. So theoretically, it's sort of estimating based on the amount of information it finds and other information it knows about you. And these are people that probably have an actual online biography posted somewhere, or maybe several of them. And then again, that would have been in its training data. But it's just generating, this is what a bio for this person would look like. And they seem to have enough information that they'd be about this old. But it's almost certainly to be wrong on those particular facts, which is a great example of why you really have to be very careful. These systems are fun. They can generate a lot of interesting, idea starters, or brainstorming, or get you thinking and going in certain directions. But they are not reliable, and probably are not going to be for a long time. And you have to check even what seems to be the most basic facts about what they're telling you and what they're giving you.
And thank you so much, Brenda. So now we will move into a little bit of discussion. So please, audience, put any questions that you have into Q&A. But going to kick things off by putting Brenda on the spot. So I love the slide about the common failures of AI. I was wondering, can you walk us through what the category of privacy violations is? Because I think a lot of people think, well, privacy, AI don't have much to do with each other. How can privacy be violated through AI?
So it can actually come in a number of different ways. If you think of AI systems, it's helpful to always think that remember that there's inputs there's the actual operation of the model, and there's outputs, and then there's sort of the application, the big context in which that whole thing is used. And errors and problems can pop up in any of those ways, and they all tend to look a little different. So on the input side, privacy is very much at risk because I think, as you said in the beginning, Amelia, when you were teeing all this up, your data might have been collected for one purpose and then used for another, and the other might have been training an AI system. And the FTC has come down on this very definitively for several years now with a brand new type of enforcement called algorithmic disgorgement, meaning if they decide you got your data fraudulently, like you violated your privacy policies or some kind of privacy protections to get the data, you have to throw the whole algorithm that you trained with that data out. And companies have literally gone out of business because of the FTC ruling like this. And even larger companies that, you know, might have more resources to be able to restart their training or something are very concerned about that particular enforcement outcome. So that's one of the most obvious privacy ways, is that data that's being collected for one purpose is being used in another way. And web scraping is sort of its own category. Like, there are a lot of legal issues around web scraping that aren't just about the data being used to train AI systems, but that's one of the key categories. And so these are some of these are some open legal questions. So like, if there's data about us in, for example, public records under a government record of some kind, you know, driver's licenses aren't open, but like marriages and births and deaths and things like that, that you could go to a courthouse and look at a book and see that data. It's public data. Can you use that? You know, is it okay for a company or somebody to collect that data and use that as part of its training data? Technically, legally at this point, yes, but that's part of the growing question about, you know, is it really what was intended by making that data public to let it then be collected and used for these other purposes? So on the input side, the data itself is very clearly privacy at risk, depending on where it came from and how it's now being used. And then in the model itself, the actual operation of the model, maybe doing some pattern analysis and generating some outputs that are personal information about you, that you didn't really sign up to have those predictions created, or those, you know, this is like targeted advertising and things like that, which we've been discussing in the privacy world for years. But if the AI system analysis outputs are more accurate and more targeted and more personal, and it's creating more predictions about you and your consumer behavior, at what point is that sort of, you know, basically a privacy violation? And then, you know, the outputs themselves can then be used also. The use case that you guys were just talking about is, you know, predicting harm, potential harm to children, which is, you know, who's going to argue with that? But if you are predicting behavior of adults to commit crimes, I think a lot more people would get a lot more concerned, even though that's sort of a very direct corollary of what we're talking about. So, you know, go watch Minority Report and decide if you're actually really comfortable with predictive analytics. Preventing harms in advance sounds really good, but if you go too broad with that and it goes too uncontrolled by human oversight or other protections, you know, now your agency and autonomy and your privacy, depending on what the context is, are very much at risk. So all along, it's all about data. You know, data is what drives AI. AI generates more data. And where there is data connected to people, there's privacy, or we want there to be privacy. So.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Brenda. You had also mentioned things that I don't know that a lot of people necessarily think of as AI, like the predictive text for finishing your emails or text messages. What are maybe some other types of AI that people may already be using and not think of as AI?
Like OCR kind of interpretation of like handwriting, or interpreting prints and fonts and you know, inputs, basically images and text and things. That's all based on AI, various kinds of machine learning. Computer sensing, so visual collection and then an analysis of that. So Ring doorbells and things that might be tied to some other I don't know that Ring doorbells are offering facial recognition right now, so please don't quote me as saying that. But if those things were put together, you know, those are the kinds of things that when it's then tied to security systems or things like that, sensors in your car that determine whether you're sleepy, perhaps, or even worse, the things that are like trying to predict road rage, kinds of states of the driver. All of those kinds of things that are in your car, in your access to restricted facilities, physically entering buildings, almost everything you probably do online with your accounts. If you call your bank and they say, we recognize your voice as one of the control features for getting on phone access to your account to be able to do something, all of those things are AI based.
We are surrounded.
You're definitely
yeah.
surrounded.
Yeah, and I think one of the ones that was a nice reminder was just search engines. Search engines are in fact AI, like things we've been using for so many years that it doesn't feel like it's actually, new and shiny in the way that we're talking about AI.
But they're continuing to be developed using more, like they weren't AI, or at least in a very different sense AI. They were very rules-based AI when they started, but they're, this is not 2001 Google or whenever Google was born. Or if this is not 2010 Google, this is 2024 Google, and it operates very differently, and it very definitely includes some AI.
So we have a great audience question. So talks about, have states or the federal government sought to regulate the metadata or content associated with AI? For example, Zoom has an AI function to capture information from meetings. What would happen to PII discussed during those meetings? Is it regulated the same way? And I'll maybe add on to that. I've gotten a lot of questions from government agencies and others about what they do when a tool like Zoom that they've been using for years now has an AI feature that they can't turn off. So, Brenda, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the short answer is no, there's not a lot of regulation yet directly about AI, including sort of generated data or metadata. The AI specific legislation is happening in real time. Like we're in the period of state legislation in the US, the beginning of the year, and there are, I don't know, 20 at least bills out among the states that are things targeted either about AI generally or about privacy that include automated decision-making controls, or about something very targeted like youth operations online or biometrics that are AI-based. So this is happening in real time in terms of states and governments trying to decide exactly how to regulate some of these categories. The EU AI Act and really the US as well, even though we're not exactly parallel in where we are in the process, are taking a risk-based approach. So basically any system that either collects, generates, or uses personal data is going to be in the higher risk categories and is going to require more testing, more metrics, more measuring, more reporting before it can be used and while it can be used. And the EU has taken the sort of stance that there are some systems that are prohibited uses. They're so high risk, or they're so unreliable, or they're so something that they're just banned entirely. Social credit scores is an example of that. Real-time facial recognition tracking by law enforcement is an example. There's 6 or 7 things. And then there's high risk, things that can be done and companies are going to do and may do, health diagnosis or health care predictions, financial services, but they're dealing with real people and their real rights, and they're going to be high risk. So they're going to have to test it. They're going to have to register those systems. They're going to have to do reporting on those systems, on the outcomes. And the US has sort of got similar things around some of those in terms of what agencies are doing, what the EO might end up driving, what NIST might end up developing. So it's happening a little more piecemeal here, not really quite as far along, but it is going to be that same risk-based approach about some systems just, if they go wrong, it's unfortunate or inconvenient or maybe even annoying, but maybe not risk in the same way that some of these others are. And there's only so much testing and so much, we all have limited resources, companies and governments included. They're going to focus theirs on where the highest risks are.
Great, thanks. On a practical level with that, do you have any recommendations when all of a sudden your favorite online tool adopts AI? How worried should people be? Because I think this is, as you said, not necessarily popping up in the law quite yet, but I think it's also not really showing up, or at least state agencies and others don't know how to deal with the fact that it is popping up in their day-to-day work, other than maybe just stop using that tech maybe. But what are,
I mean, that's obviously one of the choices is, and I think, not to pick on Zoom, we're using Zoom right now. But when Zoom first started adding some more of the analytics and features, there were people who said, wait, we can't use Zoom anymore because we're not comfortable with that. And I think, I'm not an expert on Zoom, but I think Zoom put in some controls so that you could turn some of that off so that people could still feel comfortable using it. And the enterprise versions of the generative AI, like chatbots and things that companies can buy pay for, the enterprise version that's designed specifically to integrate into their system, tend to have more of those controls as well. I mean, it's all AI, it's still going to be AI, but like they can change some of the controls and settings to match their own corporate or cultural risk tolerance in that way. If, as a consumer or user, your bank starts using facial recognition or voice recognition or something like that, you don't like it, you probably have the option to select an alternative verification method. You might have to search a little to find it. And it may not be as convenient, and they don't so far have to make it as convenient. But the best practice is that they do have to offer one. So it's a little bit context specific or case by case, but yeah, the bigger risk I think is where AI is happening all around you and you just don't even know it. And that's happening in a lot of your payment services at the back end of things, in your, general online activities, in your identification, verification kinds of systems. And people just don't even think about it. So that's why we need, in my opinion, some sort of comprehensive baseline controls in place in the same way that we have for transportation or food or electricity, where every time you interact with those things, you don't as a consumer have to stop and think, where did this, what animal did this come from? Where was it raised? What did it eat? What temperature was the refrigerated boxcar that it was transported in? Has it been in the styrofoam container past a certain amount of time? There's rules about those things, and you just kind of trust that most of the time these meet those rules and that the government is at least doing some level of oversight for that. It's not perfect, plenty of complaints about all of those systems. But overall, you trust that when you plug something in, it's at the right amount of, hertz or whatever. I have no vocabulary for electricity, apologies, but that it's going to work and it's not going to blow up your machine that you're plugging in, nor is it going to electrocute you because it meets some kind of standard. And that's really, I think ultimately where we're going to have to get to AI. And it's not going to be just one standard because it's AI. It's going to be by industry, type of data, type of impact and context. Because the standard is just going to vary. But that's what we need as consumers, is not to feel like the whole burden is on us every time to figure out, is this AI? What is the AI that's doing? What is it doing to me? What are my choices? What controls do I have? Because that's just overwhelming and nobody can do that.
Absolutely. So I guess in our final minute here, what advice do you have for state and local agency staff looking to incorporate AI? So this may be, are there organizations with resources that we haven't discussed already? Are there particular questionnaires or big, broad questions? Where should people start?
Go to NIST and look at the AI risk management framework. So it is guidance, it is not regulation, but it's becoming the sort of de facto standard. And chances are, if legislation gets passed, it's going to point to that as the default standard in light of, in the lack of any other more specified standard by industry. If you're in a state government, you also need to look to your state, because many of them are starting to pass either commissions to explore these questions, or they've already passed some kind of controls and limits on what AI can be used at the state level or how it can be used, or more likely some context where it can't be used. And, you want to be aware of whatever's currently happening. If you have people that, have a little bit of sort of in-depth understanding of this type of technology, make sure they're engaged at the state level, because all of them are grappling with this right now, and state level legislators are not any more detailed, experienced in AI than the federal legislators are. Probably a few of them are, but many of them are not. And so if you have people that have the knowledge to weigh in and make inputs for those kinds of things, or beyond those commissions and committees that are being set up, you know, I would say if you care, you should try to get onto them so that you have insight and can make inputs into the process, because that's really what's happening right now, is those decisions are being made.
Absolutely. And I would just add to that, just because you don't feel like you know anything here, join the party, with the exception of Brenda and like 10 other people. I feel like there's so little. And obviously, as all these different state and local commissions and things are being set up, jump in and learn about it. Because knowing just a little bit here goes so far. And the important thing is that as new policies are adopted, they don't prevent positive uses of AI that can benefit individuals who are, able to access new benefits, new services, whatever it is. And so making sure that, even if you don't know how AI would work around this thing, being a person in the room who can say, actually, we want to be able to provide X service, that by itself can be really helpful. So with that, we'll go ahead and end today's webinar. Thank you so much, Brenda. Thank you, Morgan. And thank you to all of our attendees. Really, really appreciate your time and interest, and hope that this webinar was useful. Thanks, everyone.